Many years ago, I set out on a walking tour, high in the Alps, a region quite unknown to travelers, where ancient mountains thrust down into Provence. The trek began on barren moors, 12 or 1,300 meters above sea level, through land that was bleak and monotonous. Nothing grew there but wild lavender. After 5 hours of walking, I still had found no water, and I could see nothing that gave me hope of finding any. Everywhere, I came upon the same drought, the same coarse weeds. In the distance, something caught my eye. A thin, dark shape that I took for a tree stump. But just in case, I walked towards it. It was a shepherd, and beside him, resting on the burning ground, lay about 30 sheep. He let me drink from his gourd, and presently he led me to his sheepfold in a hollow in the plain. He drew water, excellent water it was too, from a very deep, natural well over which he had rigged a simple windlass. The man spoke very little, often the way with people who live alone, but he appeared sure of himself and confident in his assurance. It all seemed somehow strange in this barren land. He lived not in a hut, but in a real house, a stone house, whose walls clearly showed how his own labor had repaired the ruin it had once been. Its roof was solid and strong, and the wind on its tiles sounded like the sea upon the seashore. Inside, it was neat and tidy, dishes washed, floor swept, shotgun oiled. His soup simmered over the fire. And I noticed that he was freshly shaved, that all his buttons were firmly sewed on, and that his clothes were darned with that meticulous care which makes the mend invisible. He shared his soup with me. When I offered him my tobacco pouch, he told me he did not smoke. The dog, silent like his master, was friendly without fawning. It had been agreed that I would spend the night. The nearest village was still almost 2 days' walk away. The shepherd, who did not smoke, went to fetch a little sack, and onto the table he emptied a pile of acorns. He began to examine them very carefully, one by one, separating the good from the bad. I sat, smoking my pipe. I offered to help, but he told me it was his work, and indeed, seeing how very carefully he carried out his task, I did not insist. That was the only time we spoke. When he had set aside enough acorns, he divided them into piles of 10. As he did this, he discarded the smaller ones, or those that were cracked, for now he was examining them very, very closely. When finally there lay before him 100 perfect acorns, he stopped and we went to our beds. Being with this man brought a great sense of peace. The following morning, I asked him if I might stay on and rest for the day. He found that quite natural, or to be more precise, he gave me the impression that nothing could upset him. The day of rest was not absolutely necessary, but I was intrigued, and I wanted to learn more about him. When we reached his destination, he began to drive his iron staff into the ground. He made a hole, dropped in an acorn, and filled in the hole. He was planting oak trees. I asked him if he owned the land. He said no. Did he know who owned it? He did not. He thought it was common land, parish property, or perhaps it belonged to people who did not care about it. That did not concern him. And so with infinite care, he planted his 100 acorns. After the midday meal, he began to sort out more of his acorns. I suppose I must have been quite insistent with my questions, because he answered me. For 3 years, he had been planting trees in that desolate country. He had planted 100,000. Of the 100,000, 20,000 had come up. Of these, he still expected to lose half, either to rodents or to any of the unpredictable things which only Providence can account for. That left 10,000 oaks to grow on this tract of land where before there was nothing. It was then that I wondered about the man's age. He was clearly more than 50. 55, he told me. His name was Elzéar Bouffier. He had owned a farm down in the lowlands. It had been his life. He had lost his only son, and then his wife, and had withdrawn into this solitude where he was content to live quietly with his lambs and his dog. It was his opinion that the land was dying from lack of trees. He added that having nothing very important to do himself, he had resolved to remedy this state of affairs. I was young and only thought of the future as it affected me and my search for happiness. So I told him that in 30 years, those 10,000 oaks would be magnificent. He answered quite simply that if God granted him life, in 30 years he would have planted so many more that these 10,000 would be like a drop of water in the sea. The next day, we parted. The following year came the First World War, in which I was engaged for 5 years. An infantryman was hardly likely to have trees on his mind. I had seen so many people die in those 5 years, it was easy to imagine that Elzéar Bouffier, too, was dead, especially since at 20, we think of men of 50 as ancient with nothing left to do but die. He was not dead. He had changed his occupation. He had only 4 sheep left, but now he had over 100 hives of bees. He had given up sheep because they threatened his young trees. The war had not disturbed him, and he had calmly continued his planting. The oaks of 1910 were now 10 years old and taller than either of us. It was such an impressive sight, I was struck dumb. And as he never said a word, we spent the whole day in silence, walking through his forest. It was in 3 sections and measured 11 kilometers long and 3 kilometers at its widest. When I reminded myself that all this was the work of the hand and soul of one man with no mechanical help, it seemed to me that men could be as effective as God in tasks other than destruction. The bus dropped me at Vergon. In 1913, this hamlet of no more than a dozen houses had 3 inhabitants, wild creatures who hated each other, who set snares to make a living. They were people without hope. Now everything was different, even the air itself. Instead of the harsh, dry winds of the past, there was a gentle breeze, full of fragrance. From the mountain tops came a sound like rushing water. It was the wind rustling through the forest. And then, even more astonishing, I heard another sound of water. I saw that they had built a fountain that was splashing merrily. And beside it, what I found most touching, someone had planted a linden tree, the perfect symbol of rebirth. Moreover, Vergon showed signs of the kind of labor that only hope can inspire. So hope had been restored. Ruins had been cleared and crumbling walls torn down. The new houses, freshly rough-cast, stood in kitchen gardens where flowers and vegetables grew in orderly confusion. Roses and cabbages, snapdragons and leeks, celery and anemones. It had become a place where one would want to live. From this point, I continued on foot. The war had not been over long enough for life to reach full bloom, but Lazarus had emerged from the tomb. On the lower slopes of the mountain, I could see small fields of young barley and rye, and down in the narrow valleys, the meadows were green. It has taken only 8 years since then for the whole countryside to glow with health and prosperity. Where I had seen ruins in 1913, there now stand clean, freshly plastered farmhouses, evidence of happy, comfortable lives. Dry springs fed by snows and rains, now conserved by the forest, have begun to flow again. In the maple groves, each farm has its fountain brimming over onto carpets of fresh mint. Bit by bit, the villages have been rebuilt. People have come to settle from down in the plains where land is expensive. They have brought youth, life, and the spirit of adventure. On the roads, one meets people glowing with health, and boys and girls laughing as they enjoy their rustic pleasures. Counting those who lived here before, quite changed by their life in gentle surroundings, and including the newcomers, more than 10,000 people owe their happiness to Elzéa Bouffier. When I think that one man, one body, and one spirit was enough to turn a desert into the land of Canaan, I find after all that a man's destiny can be truly wonderful. But when I consider the passionate determination, the unfailing generosity of spirit it took to achieve this end, I'm filled with admiration for this old, unlearned peasant who was able to complete a task worthy of God. Elzéar Bouffier died peacefully in Banon in 1947.